It's the week ending Saturday, the 8th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a possible chemical weapon kill over 100 in Syria, Gibraltar taking centre stage in Brexit negotiations, and Pepsi pulling their protest-themed commercial after complaints. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And with me today from the week's digital team are Ashley Wassall, Anna Dubuis and Jamie Timson. And to start the show with his top pick of the week, it is Jamie. What have you brought with you?
This is perhaps my favourite television clip of all time.
You know, people like lager and nuts. People like Coldplay and voted for the Nazis. You can't trust people, Jeremy. But maybe I should go solo. I'm starting to have serious doubts about you.
Super Hans, played by Matt King in the Channel 4 comedy Peep Show. You can see the whole thing at channel4.com. Jamie, people like Coldplay and voted for the Nazis. Where are you going with this?
Over the weekend, Alexander Vucic, who was, up until a few days ago, the Serbian Prime Minister, has now been elected Serbian President. He took around 55% of the votes. It was in a runoff election, a bit like France, but he managed to win over a majority that kind of rendered the system kind of useless in that sense, because the other opposition parties only polled 16%. But
so when you say a bit like France, it's a system that's supposed to stop someone winning outright in the first round at all?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but if he did, then that's democracy.
Well, as Prime Minister, they did a study of the amount of political programming in Serbia. He had, if you include his party as a whole, he had 92% of the political coverage in the run-up to the presidential election was about him. The Washington-based Freedom's House of Democracy Index has said that Serbia has now fallen to the lowest level since 2003, which we will remember was just after Slobodan Milosevic. Vucic himself worked in Milosevic's government as the information minister. He says that he's seen the light and he's now a Democrat and a person for the people, but he did come from a very hard right background.
Yeah, this is the guy, I'd never really heard of him before until, it was a couple of years ago, wasn't it? There was an anniversary of Srebrenica, wasn't there? And he was booed by the crowd.
Yes, yeah.
And that was because he was in the military at the time.
Yeah,
the Serbians were
and he even now doesn't defends his role in the conflict. And the Balkans are a very tough situation. People kind of can't really imagine it still going on, but they haven't actually really solved the problem. Bosnia is still divided into three. There's real paralysis in the political situation in the Balkans, and the reason that Vucic has basically been kind of waved through by both the West, and he has links with the Kremlin, as does every person who wins an election these days. The reason he's been waved through is just because of stability. He met with Merkel, and Merkel said, this is great. He has, on the face of it, said that he wants to join the EU. But if you look at public support, the idea of joining the EU in 2003, 70% of the population wanted to join the EU. Now it's down to just 45%.
So I understand, this is perhaps a significant-ish sort of European political story that we may have missed, but why are you highlighting it? So what? What do we learn from this?
I think the key question is, what do we do as Democrats when people vote to eliminate democracy? So at the moment, Erdogan in Turkey is also holding a referendum where he wants to grab more power, to change the constitution to grab more power. And do we, as purveyors of democracy, people that seemingly seem to support it, do we think it's right if people end up voting to actually eliminate their own democracy?
Just because you're holding a referendum doesn't mean that it's necessarily democratic. In case of any election, as much as we say that general elections are part of a democratic society, it makes me think of Gambia, where the dictator president Yahya Jammeh, he was in power for 3 or 4 terms, where he always received the most votes. But that was because, again, similar to Serbia, he had most of the election coverage was about him.
Or Zimbabwe, of course.
Zimbabwe, there's so many. Yeah, so it's a situation everywhere where access to information is limited, and it means that the choices that are offered to society aren't always...
I feel like as well that in the West, we're kind of seeing this situation in Serbia and in places and valuing stability over perhaps our ideals of democracy. And that's necessarily a short-term kind of plaster fix, but actually in the long term, what we're doing is letting people go back to... He himself today just talked about Tito in a kind of like, oh yeah, he was a very smart man, he brought people together, and I think that he wants to bring apart a new version of Yugoslavia, and perhaps from the West's perspective, or Western democracies, that is maybe better than having all of these smaller states and a bit more of a...
But the people of those countries can feel that way as well. It might be that for the Turkish citizens who, as you say, are going to have a chance to vote on scrapping key democratic positions shortly, those people might look around and think, Turkey is, in a pretty precarious position, let's stick with what we got, let's stick with the strength that we have. It's not just a case of countries like Britain and America saying, oh, stability is good. People in those countries want stability as well.
I think also it's probably worth just taking issue a little bit with some of the narrative. It's a pretty one-sided narrative about Vučić. I mean, he has stated, with regards to the Yugoslavian point, that actually that was a case when Serbia got ideas above its station effectively on the international stage, and he has been sort of adamant that actually, as a leader, he doesn't want to have that kind of role anymore. In fact, pro-EU support is still well above anti-EU views in Serbia. He has been fairly consistent that he wants to join the EU now. I mean, we've just had a referendum in this country, and it's become pretty clear amongst liberals in this country that there is a belief that perhaps we've done a pretty undemocratic thing, certainly amongst the 48% who voted Remain. So it's a qualification on one government's power, maybe, by joining the EU. So I don't think there's necessarily just a single narrative that Vučić is anti-democratic in every regard. I mean, he's symbolically complicated because this is the guy that after Srebrenica said, for every one Serbian you kill, we will kill 100 or 1,000 Muslims. This is a pretty controversial figure, but I think at the moment he is standing on a platform that is constitutional, that
You're
is
kind of saying
lawful, that is
by
democratic.
his word, in a way.
But also we have to take the people at their choice.
Yeah.
They know his past, they know all of this, and they voted for him. And it's not just in sort of weird and wonderful countries that you get these slightly anti-democratic results. I mean, look at Scotland. Scotland has mixed member proportional representation. It's meant to stop majorities. You need to get 45 to 46% to get a majority in that system, and the SNP have gone and done it. They just fell short this last time, but before that they'd actually got a majority. That was a system explicitly designed to prevent majority, and that is effectively a one-party state. It has, the majority, the vast majority, all bar a couple of the seats in Westminster as well. So we have a country in our own lovely democratic United Kingdom that is voting for one party and is ignoring this idea of, plutocratic democracy.
Yeah. And it's a failure on the part of the opposition parties, isn't it? I mean, that's a big thing that people say about Serbia, but also about Scotland, is that, part of the reason that the SNP have a carte blanche, or did, now it's slightly different, is because there wasn't an effective opposition to stop people. And maybe it's a call to arms. This kind of thing is a call to arms to opposition parties across Europe, if you are in this situation, to kind of unite around one figure.
Well, this is the thing that happens, isn't it, when you do have a dominant figure, and you can see this in Westminster as well, is that people in the opposition party sort of give up a bit. I mean, this is what's happening in the Labour Party, isn't it? They could be, at the moment, putting a pretty strong fight back after Brexit, and they're not, because a lot of the key figures are saying, oh, well, we're going to lose this next one.
It's one view that sort of takes hold amongst the public, and if the opposition aren't sort of tapped into the zeitgeist or whatever it is, then you end up with this
domination. And I think it's also
domination.
They're wanting to hold on to their jobs. So actually they're not thinking about a unified, they're thinking just specifically about their own constituency and whether or not they can save, I think particularly in Labour's case, whether or not they can save in what is certain to be an annihilation now, whether they're going to be the ones that go. And, and that's a problem with, I think, our system in the way that we do parliamentary democracy in that sense. But it's also a problem with the party not... they talk so much about wanting to be a party a party of government, but actually what are they doing to provide that opposition?
Well, the Labour Party are apparently doing things. This week, Jeremy Corbyn, he spoke to ITV News and said that all the attention about the Labour Party being in crisis is diverting attention away from actually what the Labour Party has been doing. So I would like to know what the Labour Party has been doing.
Did you see, though, in terms of the Labour Party and journalism, did you see the Twitter conversations that went on. I think it was on Thursday evening. It might have been Wednesday evening. It was a journalist from the Times, the Red Box section of the Times, who was talking about the Labour Party press office being the worst in British politics. They take 6 hours or more to come back, sometimes don't. They never come up with new ideas about policy areas when sort of consultations come out and things like that. Whereas the Lib Dems, for example, get back in 30 minutes. They come up with new ideas, and the Conservative Party, I think, are famously good at this. They're famously good at making sure their voice gets across. If you can't organise a press office, how can you run the country?
But what's interesting about, I think, is that a lot of lobby journalists want to be in the know, right? And when Jeremy Corbyn came in, and he got in new shadow cabinet people, the lobby journalists didn't know them. They couldn't even pick them out in a lineup. And the problem is that already, and this is a fault on both the part of the journalists and on the shadow cabinet, that already brings a huge divide. Whereas before they had these this big black book of contacts that they could trawl through and be like, oh yeah, here's it's him again. I'll get to go and have a chat with him. Now they're in a situation where they're having to go, oh, who's Rebecca Long-Bailey? Like what's that about? And that has already created a divide in a way that the Tories don't have.
Okay, well, who is Rebecca Long-Bailey is a question we're going to pose in a future week, I'm sure. But for now, let's move on to Anna. You're up next. What do you think this week is going to be remembered for?
Are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin.
Many centuries ago, there was a man called Pygmalion who lived in Cyprus. He was the best sculptor of his time, and his statues almost lived and breathed because they were so perfectly made. Pygmalion, as every great artist, had some eccentricities. All girls, he thought, were as annoying as his sister. Girls. Who needs them, he thought. Life, he considered, should be dedicated to art, not women. If he was going to put anybody or anything on a pedestal, it would be a statue.
That was an extract from Pygmalion, a bedtime stories collection. You can find out what happens next, children, in the thrilling conclusion of that story on their YouTube channel. Anna, I dare you to make this story the defining moment of the week.
So my contribution this week is a tale about a Chinese engineer who was so tired with the struggle of dating that he just built his ideal woman and married her. So his name is Zheng Jiajia, which I don't know whether that is correct pronunciation. He's a 31-year-old who happens to be an artificial intelligence engineer, which came in handy when he wanted to build his perfect woman. He called her Ying Ying, and like any normal couple, they dated for a while, and then he took the plunge and he married her.
And his mum turned up at the wedding.
Yeah, he I think it was a surprise wedding where he just invited people around and then unveiled his bride.
I was going to say, because my mum probably wouldn't turn up if I married a robot, is my guess.
Really?
I think
if it was really nice to you and it did everything that your mum wanted from your prospective partner,
yeah,
I think she would.
You don't know my mother.
Yeah,
she was fine with marrying out of Judaism, but I just think a robot might be a step on.
Well, maybe in 50 years' time it will become more of an accepted idea.
Yeah.
There's been quite a lot of discussion recently about the rise of the robots and what that means for us and whether we're actually prepared, whether we realise how quickly AI technologies are going to be introduced into daily life. The Bank of England has warned that millions of people could face their jobs being automated in the next 15 years. And those jobs that are prime for robots to take over in sectors like transportation, storage and manufacturing. The EU actually brought in some legislation a couple of weeks ago to provide an ethical framework for using robots. But one thing they did actually vote against was an idea that Bill Gates has actually proposed recently for an income tax on robots, which would see companies using robots paying an extra tax, which would then go into retraining people whose jobs have been taken over by robots.
To build robots to marry.
For instance, that could be one aspect of it.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so we are, yeah, I mean, okay.
So
it's an extreme example of what we're seeing, which is robots taking over first manual work, then sort of what used to be seen as middle-class professional jobs, and then ultimately perhaps our partners. Is this a scary dystopian future, or is this quite exciting? Ashley?
I think it all smacks of the Luddites in the 19th century, doesn't it? It's the machines are coming, we're all going to be out of work, we're all going to be on the streets, and actually there was a massive jobs boom because the massive increase in productivity that the machines brought great prosperity and actually increased available work and increased available output. So I think it all smacks of that. We only ever see one side of this equation because we see the jobs that are going, but you can't conceive of the jobs that will be created. A small example, Ocado has brought in a number of machines on its production lines. Ocado, the company that delivers fruit boxes, etc. They have even devised a robot now that can pick fruit. It was the one thing that a human could do because you needed to be able to test the firmness of the surface of the fruit. And now they've got a machine that can even do that. They have increased their workforce whilst all these machines are being rolled out. They have brought in machines to do most of the fruit packing in their main factory now, and yet they are making more jobs. They are shifting their business model and creating machines for other factories that do things like this. This doesn't have to be job destruction, and even if it is, if it massively increases productivity, the big problem with the UK economy is productivity. If we massively increase productivity, there is no reason that the overall wealth of the UK needs to drop. You just need a new model to cope with it.
It's about who has the money, though, because it's inevitably the people that own the robots or the machines will be the ones getting rich. Like, in the sense that you or I, if we don't own a robot or a machine that can do that we're not going to be able to make any of that money. And if anything, if it takes my job, but the person who owns the robot is the one that's making the money out of it, in the end, I've lost out here. And it's about the share between who has the capital and who has the labour.
So we're back to Karl Marx and means of production and ownership of means of production. It feels a bit of a careworn argument, if I'm honest. I mean, yes, there is an argument over who owns the wealth, but there's always been that argument. It exists now. Whoever owns wealth, whoever owns the companies, they do take the majority of wealth. What you do, you have a system that tries to even out the bumps, or at least tries to make sure there is a basic standard of living.
Redistribution, right?
Yeah.
So widespread redistribution when the robots come,
What
and we
you're
live in a
talking about-
socialist utopia.
Well, I would disagree with that. I would
this story about Jeremy Corbyn as well.
I would suggest what you're talking about is having a different model for how we distribute. So, for example, you might be talking about a universal basic income. But it may also be possible that someone doing 3 hours work in a software-based role working from home will be able to earn the same amount of money they would have been working 8 hours
So we just price
if
jobs
the output
differently.
is better. So the model is what's going to change. And it will probably change quite radically. But this idea that basically, I'm going to be eating out of bins while robots are walking around in 3-piece suits doing all the work, I just don't see it somehow.
But there's also a loss of human interaction, isn't there? Which is something that, you can't necessarily quantify economically, but is possibly to our detriment as a community. Every time you go to the supermarket and they've replaced someone who used to pack your bags with a machine that says unidentified object in the bagging area, and you no longer have a choice even about whether to use the human or the machine, because that's the direction of travel, because they're so much more efficient and it generates more profits for the supermarket. Not only are those workers now redundant, they're no longer working in the Tesco or the Marks and Spencer, but actually you as a customer aren't seeing another person. You're picking up some vegetables and paying for them.
Eventually a robot will do your shopping for you.
That's true.
So eventually it'll just be robot to robot.
Right, and that'll be less human interaction.
But you'll
for
have
us.
more time to spend talking to people, doing art.
Having meaningful interactions rather than talking to the checkout.
Yeah, rather than
man or woman
talking
at Sainsbury's.
to the
Will we be
checkout
actually
girl.
having human-to-human interaction, or will we just be sitting on our computers and phones?
So that's
Or marrying them.
that-
That's the
Or marrying
dangerous
them.
thing that you've brought about, isn't it?
Yeah. So this week, Elon Musk has brought up this new company called Neuralink, which is basically, if everyone's seen Black Mirror, so it's a chip in the brain that basically makes your thoughts into a kind of computer action. And they are developing the idea. This is a bit of a pet thing of mine, but there's a website called Wait But Why, where a guy called Tim Urban, he basically delves into a subject, does so much reading over the course of 3 weeks, and then produces 2 or 3 articles on it, and basically explains it to you. And it's so nice because it's all done with little drawings that he does, and it's all written in a way that you can understand it. And he has done one 2 years ago on artificial intelligence, and it literally blew my mind. I cannot explain to you how incredible it was to see what people are thinking about artificial intelligence and where we are on a scale. And I think the big thing, I'm just going to tell people to go and read it because I can't do it justice. But the big thing is that basically everything that we've seen about robots has really made us perceive them as something that they're not. Movies have presented unrealistic kind of AI scenarios, and it kind of has made people think that AI shouldn't be taken seriously. So there's a guy who works in AI that kind of compares it to the situation if the Centers for Disease Control started issuing serious warnings about vampires. and we'd be like, nah, it's not going to happen. And that's the thing, is because it's very difficult for us to conceive it, basically because all of the stuff around it has been kind of poor. But I think within our lifetimes, we're going to have a situation where AI is not just ubiquitous, but is actually kind of running things.
If we go back to the Chinese man, he's obviously created his ideal portrayal of a woman. The model that he's created at the moment doesn't move, and she has limited vocabulary. There's the rise of sex dolls being created. There's one company in the US called Real Doll, which is on the brink of releasing dolls that actually think and speak and can interact with.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, that could mean the end of sex workers, couldn't it? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
You'd have to ask a sex worker, because I imagine that they would probably want, if they support their industry, then they would not see it as a
well,
positive.
it's hard to say, isn't it? There are some people who would say, politically looking at it, saying, well, sex workers is a kind of exploitation, so better to not have that and have people use machines instead. And then there are other people who say, well, they provide human intimacy, which is exactly the thing I was talking about in terms of the robot checkout.
Is there an argument that not
intimacy sexually, but intimacy in a one-on-one relationship?
Is there an argument that none of this is good or bad? It is inevitable. The iPhone was inevitable. AI is inevitable. These things are going to happen. It is going to change the way the economy works. There's no point saying, let's let technology stop here, please, because this is where I want to get off. Like, that's just not how it works. And you're not going to continue to be able to improve humanity or the global economy if you do something like that. So what we need to do is just talk about how we can best utilize it, rather than the sort of rather redundant binary, is this good or bad?
Okay, so let's set some rules. Can you marry robots? Yes or no?
No.
No.
Yes.
Yes, says Jane.
Yeah, I mean, people
Yes,
say that.
says Anna.
No, I'm not saying yes. I'm saying in 50 years, people say that it's going to be feasible. But I think there is a case of, is it good or bad, especially with the idea of relationships with robots. The robots that are being created, they objectify women. They're an idea of women of like who's docile and easy.
But they're created by humans.
Whatever your feminist credentials,
Yeah.
if you're designing a robot to have sex with, you're going to create an attractive one, aren't you?
I mean,
that's
Oh,
not-
no, I'm not talking about attraction. I'm talking about like their behaviour. Like
just in the sense of commodifying a person.
Massively, yeah. I mean, like the fact that these sex dolls are always like sexually available, they're compliant, they're the idea of a woman that isn't realistic.
How does it affect your behaviour with real women? Surely it's going to have a negative effect on your interaction
Presumably the
with...
software crashes every now and then, so that's effectively a not tonight, dear, isn't it?
Are we not in danger of over-humanising? I know they've given these things human faces, but humanity long ago designed machines that could be used for sexual pleasure. That is not a new thing. The only new thing is the package it's being presented in. So whether or not the law classifies this as a sentient being you can marry is a different matter from people are having sex with things that are made of machinery.
It's also classically human, isn't it? That the first thing we think about is like... Or like, it's the first question that comes up is like, can we marry it? Can we have sex with it? Like, what a
Not necessarily
ridiculously...
in that order either.
Like, yeah, it's like, what a ridiculously human thing.
Ashley, what have you brought us today?
This week I've picked an excellent story.
Even by the standards of hashtag fake news and ludicrous media manipulation, this story in the Telegraph, which the Prime Minister has responded to, you'll remember that she refused to condemn Donald Trump's ban on refugees, Christian, Vicar's daughter, but she's been very quick to condemn a complete nonsense confected by the Daily Telegraph about Easter eggs and Cadbury's and the National Trust. We'll get on to that later in the programme.
0345 60. That was James O'Brien speaking on Tuesday. You can catch him on LBC weekdays from 10 till 1. We are talking about National Trust Easter Egg Gate. Ashley, why did you choose this as the most significant story of the week?
I chose this because it made headlines this week, despite the fact that it shouldn't be a story that makes headlines.
Remind us, actually, for those who missed the story, what it was.
So the National Trust and Cadbury have been promoting their annual event around the Easter holiday. It's an Easter egg hunt. This year, they have been going with a marketing strategy that has on an egg the Cadbury Egg Hunt, rather than the Cadbury Easter Egg Hunt. Mm-hmm. So the Archbishop...
You just called it an Easter egg hunt. So here at the Week podcast, we're keeping true to Judeo-Christian values.
And actually, to be fair, Cadbury kept true to it, because on their website, www.easter.cadbury.com, they were pretty clear that this was an Easter. It says, the big slogan at the top of the page is, it's Easter time, come and have some fun with us. The National Trust has it on their website, and yet the Archbishop of York felt the need to say that Cadbury was spitting on the grave of its Christian founder, and Theresa May used the venerable office of Prime Minister to call the whole affair ridiculous, not once but twice in a news interview with ITV. So I guess the question is, why is the Prime Minister using her office, her venerable office, in order to dignify this completely nonsense and confected story with any kind of airtime?
Well, it's not nonsense. The word Easter wasn't on all of the promotional literature. That's true.
It was on every bit of promotional literature that mattered, in my opinion. I mean, let's be honest, this is an independent company sponsoring an independent charitable organisation's event. They had naming rights. Everywhere you look on that website, it says Easter. It's in the URL. It's on all of the posters. The only way the Telegraph could make the story work, in fact, was to cut out a part of the poster that didn't have Easter in it in order to have the bit that didn't. So I just think this is a story about
was a Telegraph
nothing.
journalist who confected this, was it? Or was it a publicity stunt on the part of the National Trust?
Even if it was... Do you know what? Let's go with the idea that it could have been put out there by, say, Cadbury as one of those news stories that sounds negative but actually gets an awful lot of publicity. That still doesn't justify why Theresa May is coming out as the Prime Minister, who's meant to be engaged in the biggest constitutional negotiation this country's been in a generation.
She was asked about it. Like, the thing that, if we're talking about ITV journalists, they were asking Theresa May a question in Saudi Arabia, and they asked her about bloody Easter eggs.
No, but she will be asked about lots of things while she's there, and she can just dismiss something.
I'm not
like
100% sure, but I just think don't ask that question. Don't ask about Easter eggs in Saudi Arabia.
All right, fine, exactly. So you're saying two different things. Jamie, you're saying journalists don't ask the Prime Minister that question.
Yeah.
Ashley, you're saying Prime Minister don't dignify that question with a response, but ask the question. So Anna, what do you think? Should the question be asked? And if asked as Prime Minister, wouldn't you just simply say, yeah, I think it's wrong, they should call it Easter? What's the big deal?
So as a journalist, it's amazing. Well, of course you ask the question, because look at the response and look at how many headlines. It's an amazing story. So everyone's got an opinion about it. So I think a journalist has every right to ask wherever they are. But yeah, Theresa May's in Middle East. You'd think that she had something else more pressing to talk about. But I think the stance she took was absolutely ridiculous, to take her words. I think that it's just looks petty, and it's bizarre that she'd be that fussed about something like this.
So Matt Chorley, who does the Times Red Box, pointed out that the way that she described the Syria chemical attack later that day, she used the words, "We condemn the use of chemical weapons in all circumstances, if proven," and she described it as if it is allegedly Assad. So she basically wanted to get the facts right before accusing Assad of it. Did she want to get the facts right about the National Trust and Cadbury?
Is there a difference in significance, do you think, possibly, Jamie, between, the allegation of use of chemical weapons against your own people versus dropping a religious holiday from a chocolate?
You wouldn't know that from Theresa May's response, though, would you? Theresa May's own language made one sound more important than the other, and it wasn't the one you might think.
OK, I guess what we're getting to here, though, is whether or not that's her fault for playing the game. You're talking about, basically, the sort of Daily Mailisation, aren't you, of the news agenda. She knows... She's a vicar's daughter. She's representing that kind of constituency. She knows that this is important to those people, the people who vote Conservative, the people who call James O'Brien on LBC and tell him he's wrong. That's who she's talking to when she's asked that question. What's wrong with that? That's her constituency.
It's because her response was disingenuous. It's because it wasn't a case of, yes, do you know what, they have completely airbrushed Easter, and whether they can do that in a free market or not, the Prime Minister has an opinion on that. They never even did that. This was a dog whistle, if you will, to the kind of people you're talking about. It was, let's say this thing is ridiculous because it's making a headline, because the kind of people who are worried about the, de-Christianisation of our country, they are going to be very, very concerned about this sort of thing. And for me, it kind of harks back to, what kind of politician do we want running this country? Do we want the kind of politician that goes out of their way to virtue signal and show to their core demographic that they are in touch with their beliefs? So in her case, it's making sure that she's, showing she's concerned about how much the Christian underpinning of our society is being eroded. Or do we want the kind of politician who is an aloof elite, who doesn't really know much about what's going on in these circles and doesn't care and would respond to that question, which I agree with you, Jamie, by the way. I think as much as I think it's on her not to answer it stupidly, it is a clickbait question. But she should answer that and go, that's none of my business. I'm here to do an important trade deal. This is, that's how she should have responded to it. Do we care, for example, that David Cameron didn't know the price of milk? I actually didn't care at the time. That's not really what I want David Cameron to do. He's got civil servants who are meant to know the price of milk. He's meant to just make decisions based on evidence given to him.
I disagree, because I think David Cameron not knowing the price of milk shows that he's totally detached from the real society.
But did you think that he went out and bought milk on his own? I didn't.
No, but still, he should know these things. There's a line between attempting to be really down with people, such as David Cameron saying that he was he was a West Ham fan when actually he was supposed to support Aston Villa.
Yeah.
And I don't...
Can we all just pause to remember Gordon Brown and the Arctic Monkeys as well, please?
Yeah. couldn't name a song.
Favourite band?
Right,
Favourite band.
Tony
yeah.
Blair
I love
and
that.
Deirdre Rashid.
Yeah. And then you've got the opposite, which is Jeremy Corbyn. I believe he once was asked to point out who Anton Deck were, and he had no idea. And that also shows that there was no attempt to...
He doesn't care for it.
He does not care for it. And I feel
But
with
that's
that
one of
one...
the few times I was actually really in favour of Jeremy Corbyn. He doesn't need to know who Anton Deck is. He's the leader of the opposition. He's got a busy schedule. If he doesn't want Anton Deck's Saturday night takeaway, that's probably to his credit.
Yes, but, okay, I believe, from watching the thick of it, a prime minister or a political leader every day will be given like a list of kind of what's going on in the country. Jeremy Corbyn might not watch Saturday night takeaway, but he needs to realise that a large... People that he wants to support him do watch it.
He does need to win those votes.
Yeah.
So, but are we honestly saying we think it's a good thing that people would vote on a potential leader of the country based on whether or not they know two fairly popular anodyne Saturday night television
and what they think
presenters?
about a chocolate Easter egg and whether it has the word Easter
exactly.
egg.
Okay.
No,
And
well,
ultimately, do we
think people
want a
do.
prime minister that has to read a document every morning saying, by the way, the co-op's milk is now 86p a litre or whatever? Do we want that in our leaders? Because I don't.
No.
I
No.
don't care. I
Yeah.
want him to make decisions. He doesn't buy his own milk. He's never going to buy his own milk. Let's just acknowledge that fact and let him talk about the things that actually matter.
I
in
also
his job.
felt like with Theresa May particularly, all of the stuff that was coming out afterwards was saying that it was because of a long-standing dispute she'd had with the director of the National Trust, who had worked for her and had been like a thorn in her side throughout the time of when she was Home Secretary. She got rid of her, and that's what certainly civil servants told Stephen Bush of the New Statesman, that it was a real thing that she can attack. And on her first PMQs, she really went after Tim Farron, supposedly because of quotes of things that he'd said about her way back in 2005. This is, I think, a woman who bears grudges.
Right, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Ashley Wassall, Anna Dubuis and Jamie Timson. If you want an overview, a précis of the week's news, everything you need in your political life, you don't need to have a civil servant printed out for you. You can just visit theweek.co.uk, download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or of course you can get the magazine direct to your door via theweek.co.uk/subscribe. There isn't a page about the price of milk in Co-op, but it's got everything else summarised for you. And you can hear every episode of The Week Unwrapped until the end of time itself. Just hit subscribe in your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.